Thank you very much for coming. Thanks everyone for coming back inside. I see you have the coffee. And I also see two gentlemen who are doing exactly what I was going to ask you guys to do now. We have, I just spoke to our local health officer. As we always assign one to Purple events. You know that. I want to tell a little story. So this event is half handcrafted. So we have worked with a lot of providers of small services, but we've also done a large portion ourselves. And I'm happy to reveal parts of that. The rest of the reveal comes later. We bought a lot of water for you guys. This is 160 liters of water. We have medium sparkling and still water. So please, our health officer asked, please drink more water. We have noticed that all of you should be heavily dehydrated by now. So please don't only get a cup of coffee, but also supplement your coffee diet with 2 or 3 glasses of water over the next hour. With that, we'll go back to the normal program, and you can already see that we have our next speaker up here. Over the last year, the Purple Foundation has worked quite successfully and collaborated quite successfully with the Broadband Forum. I myself had the chance last week to actually talk at the Broadband World Forum as part of the base workshop as the program, and we wanted to do exactly the same the other way around. So we invited the Broadband Forum, we invited Robin to come over and also give his perspective here at the Purple Summit for those that weren't there last week. And also to get their perspective a little bit how Purple can actually help and how those two organizations can together work with ISPs and everyone else from the ecosystem there. So without further ado, give a round of applause for Robin.
Okay, so good morning. Thanks for the introduction, and it's certainly so good to be here. I was kind of wondering, who was going to be, in the audience, who would be coming here, and it's certainly an interesting sort of like group. And I would sort of say I feel like I might be a little bit in the lion's den. So when I give my presentation, please bear in mind that I'm the CEO of the Broadband Forum. I'm kind of responsible for strategy. I do a lot of kind of the business development kind of activity, and also running the organization. So don't fire too many kind of technical questions at me. I know enough to be dangerous. It's kind of always the way I kind of characterize what I sort of do. But I do understand kind of where we're sort of going, and I think I have a very good appreciation for the potential of what we're going to do with Purple Foundation. And so let me sort of get into a little bit sort of like more about so the focus of the sort of BBF. So we've been evolving for quite sort of some time. For those of you that sort of know our history, we started off very much in the kind of the DSL space. I mean, that's what we were called originally, was the DSL Forum. And but the aims and objectives of the organization really haven't sort of changed. Even though we started off really in the DSL space, just so purely in access, it was really about kind of popularizing the technology. That was really the original purpose of the forum. But it kind of gradually evolved into how do we address the technical issues that are getting in the way of deploying that particular technology. So it went from being sort of like more marketing, then heavily into resolving issues such as, so architectural standards, so developing conformance, then obviously that moving into developing interoperability, so reducing complexity, reducing cost of deployment, and then eventually leading into the management space, and as you all know, what we did with TR69. So very much, though, always being focused on how do you have mass deployment of broadband. And that's why I sort of say, I think sort of today, even with the advent of all the technologies that have happened, sort of since then, So when you look at kind of fiber deployment, you look at these sort of 4 areas that I kind of have up here. So, you know, looking at what we do with sort of 5G, generally in the connected home, cloudification, all of the next-gen access technologies, our thrust is still very much the same thing, is how do you get to that mass market? So, you know, frankly, in Western Europe, North America, large parts of Asia, you can say that penetration is such a high rate that, you know, we've succeeded. We kind of won the battle for that, for mass deployment. But now you move on to this, you know, the next sort of frontier, which is obviously how do you increase value for those subscribers? You know, how do you move from, say, just giving them connectivity and just giving them gigabit speeds? How do you move to truly a quality of experience that then leads into these new services? So that's kind of got us onto our next sort of like phase. So we also started off as being just a regular standards body, you know, the regular kind of waterfall kind of processes. And, you know, I mean, I was talking to somebody the other day, and I'd kind of sort of forgotten this, but when I joined the organization, we were still fairly paper-driven. It wasn't quite as archaic as it was at the beginning. At the beginning, you were given a wad of paper when you came to a meeting. When I joined, it was still like everything was given to you on a CD. Now we've moved to this sort of process where it's much more agile. So not only do we produce, you know, everything is online and we're using kind of collaboratory kind of tools, we also a couple of years ago developed the infrastructure so that we can do open projects. So this was kind of where this concept of open broadband came from, was how you marry open source techniques with open standards. So of course we've always been open on the sort of standards front. It's always been open to anyone that's interested in broadband technology to join. But open source, of course, was a new concept sort of to us. So how do we sort of deal with this? And so on the tools front, you know, we use Confluence. You know, our wiki is really the way that you interface with the organization. It's how you have those ongoing sort of like discussions. But then on the IP front, so let me just kind of be blunt about it. You know, we were and still are a RAND organization when it comes to developing our specifications. So that would be, you know, if you're developing, you know, architectures, the management framework, so TR69 and USP is delivered on a RAND sort of basis. So we are still safe harbor for that intellectual property. However, we also recognized at the same time when we started to look at a lot of the open source projects that, of course, you know, who could disagree that developing reference implementations based on those standards should be open source. For us, the issue was how do we do that in our RAND framework, but we developed a way of doing it. So several of the projects I'm going to sort of talk about are part of the Broadband Forum, but interestingly enough, and I don't want to sort of confuse anyone, but we actually developed these projects as projects under the board of directors. So they aren't directly within the technical committee, but there's a relationship, obviously, between the technical committee work and the work of each of these separate sort of like pieces. We have been doing, you know, obviously doing software a very long time. You know, frankly, when we started to look at developing these open broadband reference implementation kind of projects, a lot of the kind of questions sort of came up. Oh, it's like, you know, the BBF is now kind of going into sort of software. And of course, this is kind of bizarre. You know, it's like, no, we've always been doing sort of software. It's just, you know, maybe we didn't always think of it sort of like this way, but you know, TR69 has been around a very long time. And of course, we were always in the business of developing data models. But I think what I'm trying to sort of get at is that we kind of, this became a much more conscious process for us. That the more we looked at how do you develop these open source software projects, it became a question of, are our techniques, were the kind of methodology we were using, did that need to be developed sort of further? Did we need to get more agile, to sort of coin a phrase? And I think we realized that, yes, we did need to get away from that waterfall approach. However, we couldn't lose the idea of developing consensus. And I've got to sort of say, I resonate a lot with what Mike was sort of saying from the operator point of view, and what their end goal is. I think is sort of something that would be sort of shared by the Broadband Forum, community, and certainly the operators involved in the Broadband Forum, I think would absolutely echo this approach that, yes, you want to be agile, but you absolutely want this mass market. So how do you achieve that mass market? Well, you drive consensus, particularly amongst the operator community, because then if you've got those requirements really in consensus, that's what can lead to your big mass open market. So let me sort of like look at this. So there's sort of 3 projects that I thought were particularly, relevant to this group. And but before I kind of get into that, I mean, I was having some interesting kind of offline discussion before coming up on stage, and I think there's maybe a couple of things that we should try and do as a community, because we have had some very good cooperation, I think, with prpl, but sort of frankly, I think we can probably do better. In all honesty, I think that most of that project has been run between the last one of these 3. So the Open Broadband Map project has been the one that was first aimed at the cooperation with prpl. Some of that has kind of moved on, and actually our USP agent project has also worked very closely with prpl. But this has been still fairly organic. What I think we could probably sort of do better is, I think we should actually be more strategic. I think we should probably have much more strategic discussion between the organizations, between the various, between the 2 communities, and actually beyond just the BBF and prpl, we could go further than that. Because I think if we're going to realize that aim that Mike was talking about, and I really don't think, Verizon aren't on their own with this. I think there's plenty of other operators that would absolutely sort of resonate. But if we're going to really drive that, I think we really do need to pull in more operators. In honesty, I think we need more operators. I think we need a much stronger story to the vendor community, because I think the question that came up earlier, I think, this whole idea of what's in it for the vendor is also a very important question to answer. You can't just have, one of the dangers, I think, sometimes when we sort of talk about open source projects and, what kind of the drivers are, sometimes for some vendors that can be a very scary proposition. It's like, so what are you taking away from me? What differentiation are you killing in your process of your drive for open source? Now, I don't think that's the case with the work between prpl and BBF. And let me emphasize that. I really don't think that's what we're doing at all. But are we doing a good enough job with, one, having a clear strategy between our organizations so there's no overlap? Because I think that, and I know that came up in the last sort of talk, I think that is a definite question that we should answer. But I think the other thing we should answer is, as a more joined up community, we need to, I think we need to message to the wider broadband community much clearer. What exactly is the strategic aim of these projects? What are we trying to achieve? What then is the buy-in for the operators? Because then we can maybe get more of those operators in. And at the same time, I think we could make a lot of vendors feel much more comfortable that the direction we're going in is actually extremely beneficial for them. that they can benefit from this mass open market being available to them. And I really don't think you can underestimate those messaging issues. So last week at Broadband World Forum, I held a workshop. I was chairing a workshop on 5G. And one of the big subjects for that, of course, was the 5G RG. And so one point that Lance Kunders made from Verizon, so Mike's colleague, is he made this sort of comment which really kind of struck me, because you don't hear many people sort of say it quite as bluntly as this, and you really don't hear operators say this, I think, enough, is that there is a relationship between how much we're really looking for from open source in a given project and how much really needs to be differentiation from the vendors so that you have this more kind of healthy ecosystem. And that's basically what he was talking about, was this sort of idea of what's the grand strategy and then what makes for a real kind of healthy value chain in the whole kind of community. He actually mentioned a number, and he sort of said, well, maybe it's something like 70-30. Maybe there's that kind of relationship between, so maybe 70% of it is open source and there's 30% to the bells and whistles on top, the differentiation from the vendor. I mean, who knows whether that's exactly the right percentage? But what I really thought was very valuable about saying that is it gives a vision. It gives some strong messaging, to the vendor community that there's something to work from here. That it's not just a question of an expectation of, what exactly are you giving to the community and how much you could possibly get back. So I thought that was a very valuable way of looking at things. So anyway, I'll get back to the sort of meat of the sort of presentation now, but I just wanted to give that message out. I really think that kind of longer term strategic discussion would be extremely valuable. So for USP, so I got a couple of sort of slides that just sort of give the sort of the setting. I know a lot of you already know USP, but I just wanted to kind of, there's a couple of things I wanted to sort of say with this sort of slide. So one is obviously the length of the history behind the protocol. So, TR69 has been around, so 15 years. Extremely successful protocol. So we've gone from startup, and frankly, probably at the time, we didn't even think of this as being a product launch, even though maybe it was. But we think there are now 1 billion devices which are managed globally using TR69. So very, very successful, but there's no doubt we hit a wall, and that wall was IoT and virtualized services, so services going into the cloud. But I think IoT was the big one. Now, interestingly enough, it wasn't that TR69 couldn't do some of those things, because I know of a few deployments of absolute kind of end-to-end smart home solutions using TR69. But TR69 was used in a way that effectively broke it. It was pushing the parameters of what TR69 could do. But interestingly enough, and I think this is kind of an important point, is that TR69 could actually, do it. So it showed, to us anyway, when we were developing the ideas behind USP, is that this was a going concern. There really were operators that wanted to do this. There were operators that saw the value generally in how that remote management was done, but that it wasn't going to scale. So most of the deployments that personally I knew about were sub 500,000 subscribers. So in those environments, they could deal with the traffic that was being sort of generated. They could deal with the number of devices. But once you started going above that, the concern obviously is it just wasn't going to scale. So there were various issues around kind of granularity. A lot of people would sort of say, and I think probably it would resonate with this group, is that the footprint for TR69 was just too big. So, and actually I should sort of add to that. So it was too big, but also because TR69 had kind of organically grown from just basic high-speed internet services, you know, layering on top, you know, over the years, you know, things like, you know, set-top box, network attached storage, you know, all of those sort of things were added on top of it, but kind of just, that's what really led to it being kind of just too heavyweight. So we went back to sort of square one and said, okay, so if we were really interested in protecting those billion devices, which obviously we were very interested in doing because that was our community, how would we sort of do this? How could we have some kind of backwards compatibility so that we didn't kind of cannibalize our current market and the market for our members? So we came to the conclusion, yes, it needed to be a new protocol, but that was basically the reason to protect all of the data models. So that was really our migration path. That was the decision on how we would migrate. So, you know, simply sort of said, so that's what USP is a system of controllers and agents. And we went from the sort of point of view of saying that what were we trying to resolve here? Well, you know, I think it's fair to say that, yes, we were trying to address that IoT market. We were trying to address services going into the cloud. But we also recognized that we had to have kind of the multi-tenancy kind of idea. So there very easily could be more than one operator or provider involved in that sort of home, whether they were another operator in the traditional sort of sense or whether they were, you know, potentially an OTT player, or of course, you know, kind of the obvious one would be another wireless provider. So that was one sort of like thing. The other sort of side of it was moving from just management to user control. So that was obviously the ideas behind truly what you needed to deliver for IoT services. So, you know, here's kind of it's a bit of an eye sort of chart, this. But it probably the sort of biggest thing to sort of pull out of this, it is this sort of idea of coexistence with a TR69 sort of deployment. There were a lot of things that were driven over from the old deployments, and obviously, and it relies upon TR181 device 2. I'm not going to go into all of that sort of detail for now, and I'm sure you know it anyway, but you can have these slides. I'm more than happy that you take these slides away. So here's the sort of basic sort of like architecture. And, you know, it kind of pulls out those sort of like points that you can have sort of two places, or in fact more than two places for control. And the ACS, and here's the migration path, is that the ACS can manage TR69 devices or USP, and we already know that some of this exists. So one question we had from a lot of people for last week was, how much are you actually seeing in the market? There's 3 deployments that I know of that are already starting to deploy USP-driven devices. They can't be named as yet. You know, there's a certain amount of sort of NDAs around these deployments, but it's good to know that there are 3, and I hope fairly soon we're going to be able to sort of say one of these that has happened. So what are we actually sort of working on sort of like today? So there's been, so these are the USP 1.1 updates. So most of this you would have sort of seen already, and some of the work that was already mentioned, I think, in that you know, last presentation, which was very useful, and I think that kind of saves me some effort sort of like here. But some of this you would have seen actually in that deployment. So NTP, so proxy management, the controller REST APIs, support for MQTT, the bulk data collection, a compliance test plan, and then the beginnings of IoT devices being supported. So maybe the first iteration of USP did, it had the basic requirements for the sort of protocol, but this was what we needed to add in sort of straight away. And you will notice that, in fact, a lot of the requirements that drove the later developments of TR69 are in here. It's much more kind of granular, but there's some things which are very, very sort of similar. So the bulk data collection was something that we actually developed with TR69 kind of later in its life. Okay, so here's the device 2 recent sort of updates. Now, it's important to kind of say, in parentheses, it sort of says here, general. So these apply to both USP and TR69. So TR69 has not been deprecated, and that's a very strong message I want to make sure kind of is clear to the industry, is that our strategy for device management is we expect coexistence between these two protocols for quite some time. Again, that question came up last week. What exactly are you carrying on in development, and how long do you think TR69 is going to be in the market? And frankly, I think TR69 might be supported for a very, very long time, because if you look at sort of some of those kind of more typical kind of low-end users on broadband, you know, would they really have a need to migrate over? I would suspect that a lot of the migration is going to be a real kind of question for the operator, and in terms of what devices do they already have in the network, and what's their business case for migration. But from our point of view, we think we need to support this for quite some time. So you can sort of see in here a lot of this is obviously it's Wi-Fi related. That's been a very, very big push, which I'm sure doesn't sort of surprise you at all. But as I say, both of these changes support both TR69 and USP. Now these ones are particularly for USP, and again you can sort of see this is very focused on IoT. The bulk data reporting is obviously now a much bigger issue than it was in the past. I mean, it was always an issue for TR69, but of course it's going to be much bigger for USP. So here's for the USP agent. So this project sort of started later, of course, than USP did it. I mean, we took some time looking at USP and saying, okay, so we have a migration path. We have 1 billion subscribers on TR69. How do we now take this forward in terms of not just encouraging operators to go to USP, but how do we make life easier for the vendor community going to USP? So this is where USP Agent, where the open source USP Agent project came from. The code came from a particular vendor, but went through all the usual kind of processes you would expect in how it's been developed. But I think there's obviously some similarity between why we did things this way for USP and what the whole project in prpl has been. There's obviously a kind of similar thought process here. We've already gone through 2 releases, so we've been doing the kind of usual sort of bug fix sort of like work, but a lot of data model improvements as well. And then this is what we have coming up for the next major release. So we haven't made sort of solid decisions yet, but this is the list that we're looking at. So it's the MQTT, MTP support, WebSockets, the whole controller sort of trust sort of issue. Security is sort of definitely an issue we're looking at. There's a whole load of other things, but I would sort of suggest, if you are interested, one of the things with our open broadband projects is you don't need to be a member to be involved in those projects. I mean, of course, I would like you to be a member, but because these projects are not under our technical committee, they're under the board. Part of the reason why we did it that way is so that this can be truly open source and non-members can join. So if you're interested, it's a very easy process There's a fairly straightforward CLA that you sort of sign on to. But I definitely encourage you if you're interested and not already a member. So I don't need to sort of say too much about this slide because that last presentation was excellent, looking at exactly what's happening between Isps and CommScope. So the project was completed, of course, and you sort of saw that on that last presentation. But this is also kicked on to a newer sort of project that's kind of under process at the moment. So looking at the kind of whole USP agent and the RDK. So CommScope, again, are very sort of involved in this sort of whole process, and they've been one of the real instigators for these projects. Okay, so now I'm going to sort of change gears and say, so I thought this was also very interesting for this community, is that, the BBF does more than working around sort of device and service management. So what we do with USP and TR69, because we are very kind of operator driven when it comes to the requirements that drive the organization, this was the big kind of subject that's been kind of floating around really for, frankly, probably for the last sort of 2 years. Maybe I'm doing a disservice. It's probably been around even longer than that. And you all know, what the sort of issue is. This is kind of talked about kind of endlessly. Here are the sort of like, we know these are the issues that affect the operators, the most. The majority of calls that go into call centers feature these issues. That's what they think of. That's what the user thinks of when they think that their broadband has a problem. So part of the reason why we were a little bit resistant maybe to doing this work at the beginning is, of course, it's Wi-Fi, and it's how much does the Broadband Forum do in an area like Wi-Fi? Now we have worked in Wi-Fi in terms of all of the activity with USP and TR69. Of course, we have a high interest there, and we've worked a lot in developing, APIs and sort of like various kind of sort of, interfaces that we've sort of like worked on. But directly getting involved in Wi-Fi was sort of something that we weren't sure about. But where it really kind of ended up was to say, where do you see operator requirements for performance being really addressed? That was a real problem. We did have some discussion with the Wi-Fi Alliance. We were encouraging to try and get sort of some of this testing up and running, but it was problematic. So we started to look at what the requirements should be. So what kind of sort of things should really kind of look at that? So, this is a bit sort of jokey, but so do you have internet? Of course, that's what most people think of when they sort of say Wi-Fi, that's really what they mean. Do they have broadband? Do they have an internet connection? So they do obviously think of Wi-Fi directly as a substitute for when they say broadband. There's obviously the increased number of devices, all the things you kind of sort of like know about. Operators have, obviously definitely responded, but there are managed Wi-Fi offerings of various flavors that are already sort of starting. There's a lot of proprietary stuff, obviously, out there. But then they started having these discussions in the BBF about what requirements really need to be driven. So what really made carrier-grade Wi-Fi? So it was obviously looking at the testing coverage for AP devices. We tried to be very pragmatic about it, so it was what's really being deployed sort of today, what's coming up sort of like next. And as I said at the beginning, absolutely driving a consensus amongst all of the operators involved in terms of what they thought we should sort of like look at. So, there's a fairly obvious list here. So RF performance, bandwidth, stability, interference, capacity, coverage. we addressed all of those areas. So those were the parameters we looked at for the testing, and those were the test cases that we developed. So there's a very strong focus on actually what is out there today, so you can obviously help operators in the immediate future. The test metrics are based off of real devices, so this was developed in a fairly traditional way in terms of how the BBF has always developed its test requirements. Is we don't just do it from a theoretical point of view, it's always tested in a lab with real elements that then flows back into the test cases. So effectively a little bit like we do with Plugfests. It's that same kind of interactive approach. And we're aiming, obviously, at always being repeatable, very, very well documented. I don't need to give you the sort of vocab stuff. I think you know how we do this. So why is it important to the ISPs? Obviously, it's about sort of driving down, really those customer service issues, and really encouraging that kind of whole idea in interop, and obviously security being a big issue, but interop being kind of one of the big sort of drivers here. So what do we have sort of coming up next with TR398? So TR398 has been actively tested, and I know it's been tested in North America, Europe, mainland China. I know it's also in Taiwan. This is getting very, very actively sort of taken up. And frankly, one of the things that's really occurring to us now is that maybe this needs to move. It definitely needs to be added to, because 398, the issue 1, was only really the first set of test cases. We need to add a lot more. So you can sort of see the whole kind of like list here of what we're kind of starting to look at. The issue 2 is being already worked on, but then we're starting to sort of think to ourselves that what should this look like in the sort of future? Do we exactly do something like certification? So probably not exactly certification, but some kind of conformance program, something where you have, labs that you can point at and say, okay, if you go here, they know TR398, they know how to test on 398, they have the right environment, here's a place where you can get a set of standardized test results. So we think that is a good idea to go through. But frankly, then we think to ourselves, what else should really go into a program like that? And, so we look at sort of things like, obviously what the Wi-Fi Alliance is sort of doing. We need to make sure that it's kind of well aligned there, because we obviously don't want to confuse anyone, even though we are very focused on operators as a specific, segment. But, you've got to sort of think about other things. So obviously what you guys are doing in Purple becomes very important. What we're doing in the mesh area between the two organizations. Also, what do we do for testing for USP? Because we have a whole testing program there, which again isn't exactly certification. It's probably going to be a little bit more like self-certification. But we think that there's some real value that you can sort of add there, because if you start to pull all these pieces together, from an operator point of view, do you get to a situation where maybe, I've been kind of toying with this sort of idea that maybe what we should look at is something where it's kind of operator ready, kind of in inverted commas, that would be maybe a nice direction to sort of go in. But I don't think it's just the BBF. I think maybe that's sort of something that we should think about. Is that a good sort of endpoint where you can actually have a package of things that you can deliver to the operator, who then maybe has an easier time of it, because obviously no one really likes the idea of having multiple certifications that you need to sort of pass, and you get these ridiculously complicated RFPs coming from an operator. I mean, if we could make that a simpler process, that might be a very good thing, and we could cooperate on test labs. I mean, we already work with a group of test labs, so maybe there's an interesting path forward. Okay, so map. So let's sort of get into this sort of discussion. So this was the original discussion between BBF and Purple. So I'm kind of, obviously you know exactly what sort of like what Purple sort of like does. You know, what was originally the conception with MAP is, and I think sort of Mike again mentioned this, but I think a couple of the other sort of speakers did too, that MAP was really focused on where do we need to plug gaps. So there are sort of some things in terms of operator requirements that we think we need to add, or potentially need to add, because obviously we're still kind of, you know, the work really started with prpl and then went, you know, comes over to the BBF as we move on. But are there things we need to sort of like to add? So one of the potential things is that we had a 1905.1a stack originally at the BBF. So we'd had this for some time. It was delivered to us on an open source license. Now, as it turns out, of course, that's not the way that things developed with the prpl project. There was a different stack that was then utilized. And one of the questions that's come up in the BBF community is, of course, some people are still very interested in that 1905.1a stack. So do we potentially take what prpl does and use some of that in extensions? Now, it's all going to be very organic because, of course, it means that somebody's going to obviously, you know, they have to do the work. So, you know, are there those sort of drivers? We're not totally sort of like sure, to be sort of frank, if that's sort of going to happen or not. But that's potentially one of the areas. The other kind of expected, you know, results, of course, are around what happens with USP. So there's obviously all of that device management piece, which we actually have been liaising on already. There's the whole issue around interfaces for third-party controllers. And then, you know, obviously the management sort of framework. So, you know, not just USP, but also with TR69. And I kind of put this ending bullet just, and it's not just for your benefit, really. This is actually more to the benefit of the outside community, is really just to emphasize this point, that what we're trying to do is not tread on the toes of Wi-Fi Alliance. We're obviously very sensitive to that. We respect their position, obviously, as being the owners of Wi-Fi. So what have we sort of done so far? So I think the architectural work has been liaised with prpl. I think those requirements have been taken on board. I think the other thing is certainly in terms of use cases, although I would definitely sort of take the point that the topology database work still needs some way to go. There's a lot been added in terms of the backhaul technologies. So that was one of the strengths that we brought to this, I think, is that obviously our knowledge in terms of all of the access technologies that we sort of brought in. The TR181 data model, of course, that we've talked about. Firmware upgrades, although that's kind of still an area that still does need sort of some development and some discussion. And then sort of, I think sort of like where we sort of go to sort of like next, you know, there's been that initial API design. But, you know, again, I think there's probably a lot more sort of discussion that we need to sort of have. And then lastly on that, the assessment on the technicolor sort of code. So that really kind of goes to this 1905.1a discussion. You know, it's that still needs sort of like some sort of development. Then lastly, just for your information, so here's the meetings that are kind of coming up. For all members, obviously you're welcome. We have a bunch of obviously conference calls that sort of, you know, happen in between, and but I'll emphasize the open source projects. So the USP agent and OBMAP are open to non-members. Those all happen on conference calls, and obviously what we do on the wiki. So if you're interested, do let me know. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do we, at this point in time, have any questions for Robin? And I hope you're not asking because you can all smell that lunch is already served outside.
That's the problem of being right next to lunch.
We do have oh, there's actually multiple questions. Sorry. Need to get the second microphone. Probably.
Yeah.
Looking for this. Sorry. I know, that was me. So I'll just start here, and then I'll come.
Hi, it's Indica again. As I said earlier, we have the board meeting last week for prpl, and we're discussing about, collaboration with Broadband Forum, you mentioned it, that we need to have a tighter, kind of integration. So how do you see the model working? I mean, do you see prpl more integrated into Broadband Forum, or how do you see that collaboration moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, I honestly sort of think that we could probably be an awful lot closer. There's the organisations in sort of some ways. I think the communities are obviously very similar. We have a lot of the very self-same companies involved. I think even in terms of licensing, I didn't mention this sort of earlier, but we did have initial questions about how we were going to license the OBMap project, and we actually went with what was suggested at the beginning, and then there was, as you know, prpl went through some changes, and you changed your licensing. I think one of the most positive things that actually happened at the time is we managed to react to that quite quickly and say, okay, so we'll change our licensing as well to make life easier for the prpl group. So I think in some ways our cooperation has been quite good in that we have been very responsive, but it really does sort of strike me that if we have two boards, we have two marketing groups, but that shouldn't mean that we have two different strategies. I think that to me is the most important thing, is that we have a clear strategy to the market. We've got to make it, I think, apparent to sort of people that there is a large group of operators that are supporting, that the requirements have that larger kind of buy-in. And when we show an architectural map, so I think that last one that was sort of shown with OpenWRT and how it relates with USP, I think maybe we need some frameworks like that we actually advertise to the industry. So maybe we should do things like, I don't know, so the first thing is that we should meet to actually develop what that strategy is, that we have it as a joint strategy. And maybe it's too difficult to do it between completely both communities, but I think that should involve both communities in the discussion. So I don't know, there's various ways I suppose we could sort of do that, but having some joint marketing discussion, but actually we should call it what it is. It's a strategic discussion. And then we come to some agreements, I think, between the two groups of leadership. And maybe that should lead immediately then into a white paper, something we can give to the industry. We do webinars around it. We advertise exactly where we think we're going. And, frankly, that kind of idea, and this has been thrown up by a few people, this sort of idea of kind of operator ready. If we could sort of talk like that, and we could actually agree what we thought should be in that thing, that's maybe where we should try and sort of drive support. So if people start to agree with it, then obviously it's good for both communities. We get more people involved. But I actually sort of think we probably actually, dare I sort of say this, that we actually have quite a lot of developers and contributors already involved. And maybe it isn't that we desperately need more contributors, although it's always welcome, isn't it, to have more people. More what we need is advertising to actually the people that are going to use the specifications and the software. So I do sort of think having that clear strategy agreed, having something that we can go out to the market with, I think that's the kind of process that I can imagine sort of going through. And I'll sort of say from the BBF sort of point of view, we would be absolutely sort of open to that. I think we've always been very intrigued by what's been happening in prpl, and I think everything that I hear from operators when they say why they're involved. So I've not just heard it obviously from Verizon, but what I hear from Vodafone, or sort of BT. You know, there's other operators obviously, you know, out there that are interested. But every reason they give for why they're involved is exactly why the BBF is so interested in what you're doing, because it obviously holds water. I just think we've got to be kind of closer. And the one thing I am a little bit nervous about, and I think it goes to a point in that last discussion, is we don't want to sort of see any overlap between USP and Purple. I think you made that point, didn't you? I think that maybe in our last discussion.
So, hi, I'm João. I'm also in Vodafone. I wanted to ask a quick question on that one. So I also share the opinion that we can do better in regards to having a closer relationship between Purple and BBF. So I actually really appreciate that you are here today. I want to thank you for that. And here I also want to ask you a question of if we can do anything to make some of these discussions a bit more open. Because, for example, in BBF, some of these discussions are closed. You need more participation agreements. And personally, I've been coming across this process. And that means that even though we are members of BBF, we are actually excluded from some of the discussions. So my question and also a bit of request is there anything that we can do to also help in this regard? Because it's not a matter of getting the participation agreement side. It's actually a matter of how much time these things take.
Yeah, I'm a bit sort of surprised if, so you say you're being excluded from discussions. So do you mean that there was sort of strategic discussion that maybe was between a couple of members? Yes. And it's how open that was. I mean, you know, to be honest with you, some of that can be a little bit difficult though, because part of what happens I don't think this is just true for standards organizations. I think this is very true as well for open source projects, is that sometimes you just get private discussion happening between a couple of members because they're trying to work out whether they want to do something jointly. You know, do they want to bring some joint code, you know, to a project, or do they want to bring joint contributions? And some of that gets a little bit commercially sensitive, to be frank. So I think that's partly the reason why that sort of happens. But I do agree with you, though, that we should be as open as we possibly sort of like can. And, you know, using things like the wiki spaces sort of much more kind of effectively. I think, you know, maybe we want to do sort of more things, you know, like this, and actually do it between the sort of two communities, and then invite people in. You know, so one of the changes that we just made, and maybe this really does help actually, is you know that the standards world has had its challenges recently with the Department of Commerce in the US. There have been a lot of pressures on whether you're closed or not as an organization and whether everyone can be involved. Now, I don't want to name any names. I think you all know what the history is here. But there's been some real problems around this. So what was the BBF answer to having restrictions from the US government? It was to say, okay, if we can't do these things in that closed environment, you know, let's be completely open. So we are much more now like the IETF. So everything being open. You know, you can see the process as it goes on. To your point, Joe, you know, you can see the whole process. You can see all the contributions sort of happening. You know, observers can join the Broadband Forum now. You know, we still have an access charge because obviously we still have costs as an organisation. But we've tried to make that as simple as possible for people to get involved and for things to be more, you know, open. You know, maybe what is going to sort of help, though, I mean, so not just the organisational piece, but I really sort of think one way that we can encourage the openness is by having a more clearly expressed strategy. Because, you know, it's sort of funny, I mean, at the moment, I think of most of the marketing materials that are produced, most of it is really about the platform. It's about how you use USP, why USP is a good idea, rather than sort of saying, this is actually what we're trying to address and where we see the market going to next. Maybe if we're more expressive around that, then it would encourage more openness in the discussion, because I do agree that we've got to get away from having too much being closed. But I'll kind of go back to what I sort of said about Lance Kunders and what he said from Verizon. You know, so when he made that comment about 70% open source, 30%, you know, let's sort of say proprietary or extensions, whatever way you want to put it, you know, that 30% would always be something that is more closed. Because of course that's where the IP is involved for the vendor community, and to some extent you've got to let them do those sort of things. But what can we do to make that 70% more open, more strategic, something that you would have complete visibility of as an operator? I think we can. Yes, we can do better, and we are still going through somewhat of a transformation. You know, we are much less the stodgy old SDO that we used to be. We've got away from being that waterfall approach, but we still are going through somewhat of a transformation. And frankly, I would sort of say, you should say that in a BBF meeting. I would say there's nothing to stop that discussion happening and saying, you know what, you know, we would like to be involved in these discussions. You know, please invite us. Because, you know, most of the sort of time, when a big operator sort of says that, the vendors will fall over themselves to pick the phone up to you and say, this is what we're working on, are you interested?
I just want to add to what you said. There was a Connected Home Council in the Broadband Forum meeting yesterday where we actually discussed just this. How does prpl USP fit together? So we decided we're going to start make some more materials for that. How does USP fit with prpl high-level API? How does these things fit together? Are they complementary, not competing, right? And I would also like to say back to prpl, coming from the outside, it can be very hard to, you know, understand what prpl is really doing. It's just one big GitHub. I would like to see some more openness, make it easier to understand how does this prpl high-level API work? What is prpl VRT? Because coming from the outside is very hard, and I think both organizations can be better at this and show how we can work together, and there are complementary solutions.
Yes, so what's been mentioned there, so that's our version of your marketing committee. So we call it a Connected Home Council. And the Connected Home Council it's a marketing sort of group. You know, so it's fairly obvious what they're interested in. All the things I sort of talked about. So anything that's Wi-Fi related, that's USP, TR69, the 5G, RG discussion, all of that basically goes into that marketing group. And so yes, we have been having those discussions about how we relate things. But I think maybe that's the step we should sort of take, is bring those marketing groups together, and we have that more strategic discussion. I would sort of say whoever wants to be involved in that, I think if we could drive something that, you know, in terms of sort of timing, you know, I would say, wouldn't it be good if we had something by the time of Mobile World Congress? Because there's no doubt Mobile World Congress will touch on a lot of these issues because of the 5G RG discussion. If we could come up with a strategy by then, I think that would be great. And if there's sort of something that we could get sign off between the two, you know, leaderships and do it kind of, you know, more formally, as I say, having a white paper, doing webinars, you know, maybe trying to present something, you know, jointly into different groups. You know, we do our own events at BBF as well. And at different times, you know, we've invited you. So Mirko was invited, as he said, to our base event. We will certainly do a lot more of that as well. We have a lot more events next year. So we think we have ones, well, all over the world. So we will sort of certainly do the sort of same thing. But I think it's one thing doing presentations, it's one thing doing events together. But I actually think having a joined up strategy between the two organizations is the critical thing.
Sorry, thank you. I just wanted to directly respond to that because a lot of things that you said there, Robin, actually resonate a lot with me because I've been the forefront of prpl or representing prpl towards the members for a year, and I do recognize that it is very, very difficult to come into prpl to understand what we're actually saying because we have obviously our own lingo, our own terms, and our website is not always up to date with what we're doing, and it's difficult to get into the documentation. So absolutely, and I also saw some members looking at me and being like, yeah, we told you. Yes, exactly, you told us. We are trying to address that first on a technology level to figure out where to actually put all of that information, and then the request goes out to every member because we are very much an open source foundation. Go there, send us pull requests about documentation, or tell us where we need to find someone, and then I will personally try and nag that person to actually write that wiki page or write that article, because yeah, I'm fully with you. We have lots of conversations, and to Joao's point, I think we are exactly the same for people that are not in Purple as Broadband Forum is at times, and I absolutely welcome, and I think I speak for all the members of the board that met last week, that we're very, very interested to do more co-marketing, joint marketing, co-located events, because it does make a lot of sense for us to do those things. So absolutely, that is something. And I just want to commend the OBUSP project and the collaboration with Purple members. I think that was pretty amazing. Also the demo last week. So I think we have shown that we can, if we really want to, and now we just need to up-level the documentation and marketing material.
So I should have mentioned that sort of like earlier. So that demonstration we did last week was really interesting. So Domos, who they kind of organised this with Vodafone and a couple of other companies, and basically what they were sort of demonstrating was the linkage between the Purple project, the USP agent, and another project that we've been developing. So I didn't mention it sort of here, but we call it Quality Experience Delivered. It's another kind of software project. There's an algorithm that's been developed for how you deliver quality of experience to the end user. So it's not about speed, it's about that QoE. That project was demonstrated last week, got a huge amount of attention. We did give Purple had their kind of logo on the demonstration. And maybe one of the things we should aim for in the sort of future is we do a lot more things like that and sort of show how the projects sort of like actually work together. So we don't just sort of tell them what the strategy is, but we actually show them practical examples. Would be sort of very good sort of things. And it did receive a lot of traffic. All of the operators that sort of came through all sort of like saw it, and I think it did go over pretty well. And it kind of lends itself to that idea that I was sort of saying, that idea of being operator ready, because we were plugging various elements together, and the vendors that were involved were deploying this whole kind of sort of picture. I think it came across very well.
Yep. So. Okay. If everyone's fine with that, I would like to thank Roman once again for coming here, sharing his thoughts with us. And I have seen the lunch, and I hope that you're all going to be as excited as I was when I saw it. So how about a big round of applause for Roman again, and then